I'm Phyllis Jackson. This is an interview with Charles Black in the Ray Charles Performing Arts Center on the campus of Morehouse College. Today's date, Friday, November 20th. It is 11:08 a.m. Sir, thank you so much for being with us today. We
It's my
appreciate
pleasure. My pleasure.
it. Honored to have you. Honored to have you.
Oh, thank you.
I kind of want to start in the early days. Tell me about where you grew up, where you were born, and the community you grew up in.
I was born in Miami, Florida, at home, delivered by a midwife named Miss Cooper. Is that far enough back for you? And I was there until I came here to go to Morehouse. And I've stayed in Atlanta ever since. The reason I stayed was because the first week I was here, I saw more pretty black women than I'd ever seen in my life. And I said, I can live here. And so I've stayed ever since.
Well, before the beautiful women in Atlanta, what was life growing up in Miami?
Well, Miami was a different kind of a place in the South. Many of the the non-black people were from the Northeast, and there were a lot of Jews there, and also a lot of folk from the Caribbean. The black folk were rather diverse. You had folk from the Philippines and Puerto Rico. It was rather a diverse cultural place. We still had segregation, rigidly enforced, but not meanly so for the most part. You had signs on the buses that say, whites seat from front, coloreds seat from rear. All right. You had black and white water fountains. Blacks couldn't try on clothes in the store. All that kind of stuff existed. But folk weren't as mean and ornery, perhaps there, as in a lot of other places. One interesting thing I discovered, sometime later was that if you were as black as your boots, but you spoke a different language, Spanish or whatever, you could go to the theaters and the hotels and movies, whatever. It was only African American blacks that were not wanted. Interesting. So that's the kind of experience I grew up. So, had separate taxi cabs. You had jitneys that black folk rode in to connect to the bus routes and all that. But it was a segregated environment. Schools were all segregated. As a matter of fact, there wasn't a college in Miami that I could attend at the time. I had to leave Miami. I could have gone to a school in Florida, but I had to leave Miami to go to any college at that time.
Do you remember as a young person thinking to yourself, this is weird, this is odd, this is abnormal? Tell me about a younger experience for you that dealt with your realization of being black in Florida.
I resented it all the time. I don't know how young I was, but whenever I noticed those signs, I knew that wasn't right, and I didn't like it. As a matter of fact, I would always make a point of sitting as far forward as I could in the buses. Usually about halfway or so, and just as my little thing. But again, things were so rigidly segregated. You just had very little interaction with whites. At the time I was student body president at my high school, somebody had the idea of bringing the leadership of all the high schools in town together for a little meeting. There was blacks and the whites, and we had that meeting. And one interesting thing about it was that they asked us what were the biggest problems on our campus. And the white kids said, not enough student parking, and the boys don't like to dress well. They wore their undershirts rolled up with cigarettes and sleep and all that. And I'm going, what? We don't have either of those problems. Very few students have cars. I think there was one maybe that had a car, number one. And we were very much into our styles. The boys wore tailor-made pants. You had to get them from one of two tailors, Rudolph the tailor or King the tailor, on the other side of town. It cost $17.50. I remember it very well. You'd get khakis for $2.79, so that was big. So we wanted to look good all the time, and everybody on campus looked good, girls and boys all the time. So we didn't have those two problems that the white kids had.
What were your parents like during that time?
My parents are the most wonderful, loving, caring people in the history of mankind. They were most generous people that I ever knew, and I kind of pattern myself to the extent that I can after them. They owned a grocery store, and they had, those little black and white books in preschool and all that, where you learn to write your alphabet and all that. They had a little book like that in the store, and people would come in who didn't have money for the items they needed, and say, "Put it on the book." Can you put it on the book? And they would put it on the book, all right, their name and how much they owed and whatever. And when they closed that store, there were still a lot of people on the book, and folk who would come in who were already on the book, who needed something, they'd just add to whatever their debt was on the book, without any real serious attempt to collect from the people. There was always somebody welcome at our house at dinner time. We were a very familial, centric family. We had dinner together at 6 o'clock every day. And in spite of the fact my dad worked like 3 jobs. And when I was about 14 years old, my mom went back to work because we had 2 kids in college at the time, my 2 older siblings. And so she told me to have dinner ready, that day. Well, whenever your parents told you to do it during those days, you did it, unless it was something you can get away with and they didn't know about, right? But so I had dinner ready, at 6 o'clock. When I was 42, every day after that, during the week, I would have dinner ready. I remember when I was 42 years old, we were in Valdosta at a funeral, and I was recounting some of this stuff, and my mom said, I was just kidding. I said, now you tell me, right? I'm 42 years old. And, starting at age about 15, I was cooking dinner pretty much every day of the week, work week.
So did life from your parents' perspective, when we spoke with Zernona earlier, she talked about the life lessons her father taught, how he was the lecturer and mother was the strict disciplinarian. She did the spanking. Father didn't touch her, but father's lectures were so painful sometimes and so extensive, but they loved him dearly. What types of lessons did you learn from your parents, especially in light of the segregated South?
Yeah, but one thing about my parents, which I admired, were they spoke with one voice. You couldn't play one off against the other. If you went to the one and asked for something or whatever, you said, "What did your mama say? And what did your daddy say?" And they were together in their disciplining of us. And so, we stopped trying to play that game early on. But we went to church all the time, too. My father was an elder, which is a high lay leader in our church, as was one of his brothers. And there were 3 elders. 2 of them were my dad and my uncle. So we went to church all day on Sunday, and Tuesday night and Thursday night we had to go to church for stuff. So by the time I was young, I was almost churched out. But that was a large part of the learning of right and wrong and good and evil kind of stuff. And you do that for enough years, it becomes a part of your thinking, deeply ingrained in your thinking. And my parents believed in right and wrong and good and bad. So I had a strong sense of that growing up. Not that I was always good, but most of the time. So when we were faced with the kinds of discrimination and all that sort of thing, it was clear that was wrong. That was not good. And it's incumbent upon us to do something about that. And you need to remember, too, that my generation was the generation that followed what is known as the greatest generation, the folk who went overseas to fight to make the world safe for democracy, all that. Well, the black folk went, and they came back, and they were called niggers and lynched in their uniforms in some instances. So, we were their kids. My dad did not go, but, the generation before us had an uncle who went, several uncles, I guess. But, so, we were already mad, about a whole lot of stuff, that being among them. When Emmett Till was lynched, we were a few months apart in age. So that was extremely impactful on me. I could identify, with that experience because of our closeness in age. So bringing all that with me, to college when the movement broke out, as it were, and I was approached by Lonnie King on campus about, let's do something about that. I was ready and went to the first meeting he had, about 24 of us, and from there we began to plan and organize and execute the movement here. Yeah.
When you were planning this with the Atlanta student movement, was it anger driven with an understanding that a nonviolent approach would be the methodology? Or was it a group of kids coming together who initially may have provided a support group of sorts to one another based on what each one had gone through and the challenges they had faced? What was that like, that coming together for that first meeting?
Well, we had the spark from Greensboro, North Carolina, and it occurred to Lonnie first. That was an effective way of protesting, and that we could do something like that here. And he and a friend of his, Joe Pierce, talked about it. Went over and saw Julian Bond at the Gates and Milton, and said something to him about it. You seen it in the paper, yeah. You think we ought to do something like that here? And Julian's response was, "I'm sure that someday somebody will." Lonnie says, "Why not us?" And Julian's response was kind of like, what do you mean, white man? Kind of thing. But he was a part of the initial team, and they, gathered up a number of us from that time. At the time, I was a sophomore, and I was kind of known because I was on the student newspaper staff. I was on the debate team, and sang in the AMS chorus. I was kind of a guy that folk knew around campus. So he approached me when I was just walking across campus and was invited to that meeting. But in terms of the spirit among the students, everybody came with a different kind of perspective. Their life experiences had all been different in some respect. We were from all over the country, and there were African students as well. So we had different points of reference. But there wasn't anger or bitterness, that I can recall in any of that. It was, here's an opportunity for change to make things right. And here's the way we can do that. And of course, this followed after the bus boycotts in Montgomery and all that. And so this whole notion of nonviolent civil disobedience resonated with us. And we found that was a workable proposition. Yeah.
What were the meetings like?
The meetings were interesting. In the first meeting that we had, as I indicated, there were about 24 students that were there. And one of the first things that Lonnie said to the students that we're planning these activities. If you feel that you cannot be a part of it, don't tell anybody about it, what we're doing. Just go about your business and be quiet. And we proceeded making our plans. The word got back to the presidents of the schools and the center, of course. So they called a little meeting, but Lonnie and maybe one or two others of us, and they were kind of divided as to whether we ought to be doing this. The general attitude, however, was that, we were responsible for you, and you're here for an education. They didn't want us to get hurt, killed, jailed, and all that sort of thing. So they wanted to dissuade us from doing it. But one of the presidents, Dr. Richardson from ITC, spoke up at some point and said, "I think the students are right." And Dr. Cunningham from Morris Brown chimed in with him. And so that kind of put the other presidents on the spot. So finally, Dr. Clement, who was president of Atlanta University, that's when Atlanta University and Clark College were separate, said that if you're going to do this, you should let people know why you're doing it. And from that came the idea of publishing a manifesto, which was known as an appeal for human rights. They raised the money for us. Dr. Rosalind Pope wrote the document. Julian and I and one or two others have been on committee with her, but she didn't ever call us to a meeting, and it was due the next day. And Lonnie said, "Just write the damn thing." So she wrote it, and we met, and a few little suggestions, maybe a punctuation or something here and there. Essentially, it survived as she had written it, and she used a document for some of the factual information called A Second Look that was published by a group of the generation ahead of us called ACA, which is Atlanta Committee for Cooperative Action, that included the Jesse Hills and Clarence Colemans and Carl Holmans and people of that generation. And so the document was published, which became essentially a roadmap for our movement, because it spelled out our dissatisfaction in many areas of society, including public accommodations, education, public safety, church, everything, And we did, in fact, attack all those areas in time.
was the response when that manifesto was published? What type of response did it elicit?
Well, it was interesting. In first instance, it was published as a full-page ad in the local newspapers. We had a morning paper and an evening paper at the time, the Atlanta Constitution and the Atlanta Journal. It was also published in the Atlanta Daily World, which was the existing black paper at the time. But you had to pay him in advance. Scott was on the wrong side, the publisher of that paper. He editorialized against our movement and gave us fair coverage and all that. He was a dyed-in-the-wool Republican, the only one that endorsed Goldwater, Nixon, and all those folk, when everybody else was not doing that. Anyhow, but it appeared in those papers, and then it was picked up and published in the New York Times as a full-page free ad. And I think in the Los Angeles paper, too. And it ended up in the Congressional Record. It was read into the Congressional Record. It's that kind of a seminal document. In terms of reaction, the governor at the time was a guy named Governor Ernest Vandiver. And he went on TV and said that this document could not have been written by any student in the state of Georgia. He said, as a matter of fact, it smacks of communism. It must have been written in Russia, in Moscow. That's what he said. But don't miss that blanket indictment of the educational system in Georgia. He said no student, he didn't say no black student, no student in the state of Georgia could have written it in that document. That was his reaction. But in the broader community, of course, during those days, everybody read the newspaper. We didn't have all this other stuff we got now. So you read the newspaper and you watched the news on TV. So everybody pretty much kind of knew that we had stated this position and used language like we can no longer stand idly by, and all that, and we will do whatever it takes to change these things. So we had a good basis for corralling support and mobilizing the community based on that document.
How did it feel? Tell me about the feeling of the group. Was it an empowered feeling to even get a reaction like that, especially that of the governor? But how did it make you all feel when you had this published work now in a major national newspaper?
Yeah.
So you've got the community that already is aware of it. Now you're getting national attention.
Yeah.
What was that like?
Well, we didn't have any strong sense of history and all that kind of stuff about what we were doing at the time. We did feel good that the document was as good as it was, that it was, received as it was in the broader community. And we just laughed at the governor, with his silliness. But there was no real fearfulness among the students that became involved. Now, there were some who said, no, I can't get involved in that. I don't know what I might do to those white folks. It was like the football players and some of those guys, when in fact they were just scared, what it amounted to. But we felt that we had an answer. We had a way of changing things here, and we were going to use it. And so when we had our first sit-ins at downtown establishments, we had like 200 students, and we went to 11 places. And they included, like City Hall and County Courthouse and Richard's Department Store and other department stores and the five and dime kinds of places that had lunch counters and all. And we did it exactly 11 o'clock in the morning on March 15th. And we had cased all these places. We had somebody to go check them out, see how many seats and doors and all that sort of thing. Where's the phone booth where somebody could stand and see what's happening, to call back into the office if there was a problem, all that. And with military precision, we struck all these places at the exact same time. The place that I went was the terminal train station, which doesn't exist anymore. The Richard Russell building stands there now. And there were a lot of seats in that place, and they had 2 entry doors into the white place. So I led half of our group into one door, and A.D. Williams King, Martin's brother, led the other half into the other door. And we sat down in there. One of the things we got a big kick out of was the reports that the police cars were spinning around in the middle of Peachtree Street because they kept getting these calls, got some of them over here, got some over here, from all over town. So, they didn't know what to do. And so the city political and business leadership, had to confer with each other and all that. And what they decided to do was to come and tell us that we were trespassing and to give us an opportunity to leave, and to tell us that if we did not leave, we would be arrested. And we had already talked about that possibility before and indicated that anybody who's unwilling to be arrested, if you're given the opportunity to leave, you can leave at that time. The others stay and be arrested. Many of us stayed and were arrested at that time.
How did it feel the first time you were arrested?
And I don't know, I felt really good. And, there were smiles on everybody's faces. We were doing something important. We were making an impact here. They sent us, some of us out sent us to serve 10 years at the city farm out somewhere on a road called Keys Road, which I don't know where that is, and I haven't been looking for it in all these years. But it was a place where the men were all just in a huge room. There were hundreds and hundreds of guys there, bunk beds and mattresses on the floor, which were kind of peery, and some of them had sheets and some didn't. The sheets were dirty, and then you had one common bathing and urinal place and all that. And the guys were awakened at 4:30 in the morning, and we had to go out and weed, put collard greens growing in the field, chop weeds, the whole. And the girls were taken outside to peel potatoes. So we would see, when we were going on our way to the field, we would see them sitting down outside peeling potatoes. We would say, hey, right? So we were only there for 4 days before the community uproar was such that they let us out.
So you were sentenced to, let me make sure I'm clear, 10 years?
No, 10 days.
10 days?
10 days,
okay,
yeah, at the city farm.
This type of
Right,
at
yeah.
the city farm.
Yeah, just because we asked for a sandwich. Yeah.
And you all didn't feel, you said you didn't have fear. You didn't have fear about it. You were proud of it. You knew something was happening.
Yeah.
At what point did you see that there was danger? At what point did you realize years later the danger you were in?
No, I think we knew there was danger. We'd known of other experiences before ours that, you can get killed and all that little stuff like that. But we weren't concerned about that. We were concerned about doing what we considered to be the right thing at the right moment. In terms of how much fear we had, I give an example. For when we were picketing downtown, Riches was our main target. Okay, and let me explain why they were our main target. It was everybody's favorite department store. They had a stated policy that no sale is ever complete until the customer is satisfied. And what that literally meant was that if you bought something from Riches today, and 10 years later, it doesn't work anymore, you don't want it anymore, you could take it back, and they'd refund your money or exchange the item 15 years later. Even if you bought it from somebody else's store, they wouldn't question that, So everybody loved Riches. So we made them our main target. If Riches fell, everybody would fall. And I remember one day, well, not just one day, but several days when we were picketing it in front of Riches, the Klan showed up to picket us. And we were walking this way, and they'd walk that way, and we'd walk this way, like that. And I noticed that most of them had on their white robes with a little dunce hat on, but some had different colors, that were yellow. It was red, green, maybe blue, I don't know, but there were at least 3 different colors that indicated rank, I suppose. So I went up to one of the guys in the yellow robe and said, man, that sure is a good-looking robe. Where can I get one of those? And he didn't know what to say, of course. But when they first started picketing us, they wore overalls, bibbed overalls under their sheets. All right, and you could see that, and they were, otherwise open shirts and all that. And then after a day or so, they came back with neckties on under the sheets and all. So one of the journalists from the newspaper asked him, why you changed? And one of them was quoted in the paper as saying, we wanted to show these students that we's dignified too. Those were his exact words, we's dignified too. But their picketing of us didn't last very long, maybe a week or so, maybe 2, I don't know. But they were convinced by somebody that they were helping our cause because folk who didn't stay away because of us stayed away because of them. So that increased the effectiveness of our protests and our boycott. So somebody convinced them to leave. Yeah.
What the meetings after the meeting? I can't imagine when you have an experience like that, and you all get back together and talk about it, what were those meetings like when you discussed it so you could start planning the next, the next strategy? What were those meetings
We
like?
would laugh about stuff like that. We just laugh. What happened to you? What did you say? Well, Of course, there were some people who had cigarettes put out on their hands and pulled off stews and that sort of thing. We didn't laugh about that. But there were a lot of funny things that happened, like the Klan, silly Klan, and all that stuff.
And you all viewed them as the silly Klan, and
Yeah.
they evoked so much fear in so many people for so many years.
But they didn't intimidate us. We were not intimidated by them. In the first place, they didn't have the cover of darkness like they usually have, and a whole bunch of them to one of us, which is their favorite thing to do. I mean, we were out there in the daylight with cameras and the policemen around and all that. We knew they weren't going to do anything. But it became obvious to them, too, that we were not intimidated by their presence. We took them as just some silly old ignorant people. And we went on with what we were doing. Actually, it helped us to build our participation because more students were willing to come and participate because of those silly Klans out there.
When did you start seeing that real change was happening? Or when did you start getting some results from those places that you all visited?
It took a long time. Our boycott lasted a year. As a matter of fact, it started on March 15th, and Easter was coming up time in the next year. And some of the folk wanted to go and buy those little dresses and little suits for their kids, and they'd had enough of this boycott and stuff, and didn't think it was going to mean anything in the end and all that because folk were holding out on us. And so our boycott movement thing was about to fall apart. So we had this big mass meeting at Warren Memorial Methodist Church on what was Ashby Street, now Lowry. And people, hundreds and hundreds of people came. The place was packed, and there were people all outside. They had to set up speakers on the outside. And what had happened was that the more established black community folk had gotten Lonnie into a meeting, but he didn't know what was happening. They had made an agreement with the power structure that they could reopen their stores, segregate it, and if things went well with the school desegregation, in September, that then they would desegregate their stores. And they kind of browbeat Lonnie with that business, and he came back to us, and we rejected it out of hand. Oh no, that's not going to happen. So then we had this divide. So we had this big meeting, and you had Daddy King up on the pulpit, and some of the other, leaders from the like A.T. Walden, some of those folk up on the pulpit, trying to sell this bill of goods, and people were beginning to kind of boo them down. And Daddy King said at one point, I've been your leader for all these years, and so. And one lady in a white uniform who had come down out of the balcony, walking down the middle of the aisle, said, and maybe that's what's wrong, and shook her finger up at him and said, I want to hear you tell me that we ought to go back to Richards. And she said, I'm a member of your church. I want to hear you tell me that we should go back to Richards. Well, things were, kind of testy there. So Lonnie and I think Julian, maybe one or two others, we off caucusing in the corner, what are we going to do? So somebody had the idea that we needed Martin Jr. to come to talk to this crowd. Well, you understand the backstory is that Daddy King and the established black leadership did not want Junior involved in the Atlanta movement stuff. They said, we got this. He's still with the Alabama stuff and wherever else and all that, but we got this. And they had, agreed that he would not come to Atlanta, get involved in Atlanta. So Lonnie was a member of Ebenezer since he was 8 years old, and knew Martin Jr. as ML, and he knew Lonnie as LC. He called him at home and told him what was going on, and Martin King had just arrived from Alabama and was in bed with flu-like symptoms, and he didn't want to get out of his bed, and he also didn't want to get involved in the local issues. And so Lonnie used a quote from Martin's daddy on him. He said, ML, you can't lead from behind. And that compelled him to come on down. The other thing he told me, he said, Say, Emil, they're booing your daddy. And of course, that really struck at his heart. Got up out of his bed, came down, and took the microphone of the pulpit and made what I contend is the best speech he ever made. He quelled the audience, and one of the things he said was, we cannot afford the luxury of disunity. And everybody's asking afterwards, now did he say we ought to continue to boycott, or did he say we ought to go? Nobody was really sure that he'd come down on one side or the other. But everything was quelled, and we were together, and the boycott continued because of that speech that he made. And I didn't know until about 6 or 7 years ago, when I was conducting a civil rights tour around Atlanta for folk from the Southern Regional Council. And I mentioned that, and the lady who was our host said, "Oh, I have a recording of that speech." I said, "What?" I had no idea that it had been recorded. But some guy in the audience had recorded it, and they have it. And so they played some excerpts from it on the bus. So that's something worthy of getting if you can.
Absolutely. That's
Yeah,
powerful.
yeah.
What was getting to know Martin Luther King in this era, in this time? What was he like?
Well, there was a public persona that Martin had, and then there was his private, personal persona. If he is on stage, making a grand speech, he spoke with such power and dynamism and all that sort of thing. But if you're talking to him, he spoke with a slow, low monotone. That so, yeah, and he could put you to sleep if you weren't careful. So he was that kind of guy. I was one of only 8 students that he taught in the class at Morehouse, the only class he ever taught. There were only 8 of us in the class, and I was one of them. Julian Bond was another. And it was a sit down in a hot classroom in a circle with Martin going, yeah. But the class was one on modern social philosophy. And so he was trying to help us, well, he was helping us to contextualize our movement in the broader scope of history. So we talked about Socrates and Plato and Gandhi and some of Martin's other favorite philosophers, Nietzsche and all those folks. And the one thing that he and I contended on in this class was Plato and Socrates had this philosopher king concept. And they held that people are suited for different pursuits in life. Some as craftsmen, some as soldiers, and others philosophers. There were other categories too. And they said that only the philosopher should be king, should rule, because they're the smart ones, right? And my position was, I think that's a good idea. I don't think we ought to have dumb people in charge. And King, of course, held to the position of, the one man, one vote, democracy, da. And I've said in recent years that if he'd been around during the Bush administration, he might have agreed with me and Plato and Socrates. He shouldn't have dumb people in charge. Sorry, Mr. President. But it was an interesting experience to be there with him. And I remember that he took to calling me Brother Black. That's what he called me, Brother Black. I did have that association with him.
Did anyone there, you, Julian Bond, any of the other students in that class with him, did you all have any idea who he would emerge to become at the time? Did you feel it?
Well, he had already become at this time. Remember the bus boycott in Montgomery? It was in the 50s and all that. This was at the time that I was chairman of the Atlanta Student Movement. And so that would have been 61, 62 that we had this class. So, we knew who he was, and we had kind of become ourselves by that time. And it was somebody's idea to round up a few of us to create a class for him to teach. I think mainly because he needed money. His civil rights stuff didn't pay well. Like in some cases, in my case, nothing at all. So I think it was a way of giving him some income to create this class. And we were kind of handpicked from among the students on campus, and Spelman students as well were in that class.
As the intensity grew, as ultimately it would, was there a change in the atmosphere? Did you all sense that change? That's around 61. You still had a few more years.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Did you feel anything growing in intensity as it related to the civil rights movement?
Well, there were several things that were happening earlier on. We had white involvement, students from the various colleges, including as far away as Shorter College in Rome. There were like 5 or 6 girls who had some guy to drive them down here on weekends to help us. And there were students from Agnes Scott and Emory and the like. And then, of course, you had the white liberals in town, folk from the Unitarian Church, B'nai B'rith, other kind of liberal type groups who offered their support and all that. And we were getting financial support from all around the country, which is why SNCC ended up with their headquarters here, because the Atlanta student movement was the only one that had any money. So we paid their office space for 6 months or a year or whatever, and that's why the headquarters was here. But in terms of intensity, the intensity had waned because, folk get tired after a while. Not a whole lot of folk wanted to keep picketing and sitting in and all that stuff, going to jail. Had to go back to class, and take care of your business. As a matter of fact, by tangent, while I was chairman of the movement, I was taking a class in Shakespeare from one of my favorite instructors, Dr. Richard K. Barksdale. And I'd always made A's in his classes and all that, right? And my grades were slipping. I was down like B minus in his class. And so midterm came around, and he gave me what was my favorite grade of all times. He gave me an F plus midterm to get my attention. It did. So I tightened up and did better in his class. But I was spending a lot of time, trying to negotiate with folk, organizing picket lines and all that. What had happened, Lonnie had left, and we did have this agreement in place to desegregate the lunch counters. Well, I had to administer that. So I was in charge of implementing the agreement to desegregate lunch counters. And one of the things I got to do was to decide who went to the favorite places. Everybody wanted to go to the Magnolia cafeteria at Rich's, white tablecloth kind of experience and all that. And I made a point of making sure that those established black leaders who were fighting against us didn't get to go at that time. I lost some of my nonviolent spirit, I suppose, at that point. But it occurred to me many years later that I didn't go to any of those places for decades. I hadn't been to any of them. And I was reflecting on that. I said, well, it wasn't about me going to those places, it was about making a change. But I never did get to any of them, or many of them. I think I did go to Magnolia Room once, maybe. See, what's the fuss about? When I wasn't impressed. But anyhow, I digressed a little bit. What was your question?
Tell me, if in your opinion, do you believe, and you look back on this time, you all opened doors for the generations to come? My generation, starting, with my generation. Do we really have an understanding, I think, of how significant, how dangerous, how important the role you all played, in giving us many of the freedoms that we had been enjoying for years now? Do you think we get it?
No. And I think it's partly our fault. But it's really kind of like soldiers who go off to war. And they're involved in all these atrocities. They're killing people. They're seeing people die, their buddies and all that sort of thing. They don't want to talk about it when they come back home. They don't want to talk about it. So we made a point of not telling our kids how terrible things were, before we made some changes. But our parents never talked about how terrible things were for them. And their parents before them probably never told them about, in the generation back, about slavery, how terrible things were for them. You don't want to burden your kids with this terrible bad news. You think that things are always going to be better. They're going to get progressively better. And, and oh, happy day, So we didn't make sure that the succeeding generations understood what it took to get to where we were, or what we had experienced before. And I think that's a major failing on the part of our generation. So I repent that. trying to make up for it some now, spending a lot of time with existing young activists to try to help them understand that. But we didn't have a great appreciation ourselves of what had happened before us. There was part of the tension, I think, between our movement and the more established black leadership at the time was that we didn't really have an appreciation for what they had done. And many of them had suffered all kinds of things, like John Calhoun, when Secretary of the NACP here, went to jail because he wouldn't give up the membership rolls, of the NACP. Other folk had, suffered all kinds of things, and they had fought battles in the courts mostly. And their approach was generally that, the NACP Legal Defense Fund is the way to change these things, and let's keep doing it that way because that's the way we've always done it. But we were less interested in evolutionary change. We wanted revolutionary change. We wanted things to change kind of here and now, not in the sweet by and by when our grandkids come along. So that created some tension there. The other thing is that the more or less established black leadership had their own relationships with the white political and economic power, in that they can get favors for an individual person, their own family member or friend or whatever, get somebody out of jail or help somebody get a meaningless job or what have you. So it was a patronage kind of thing for them, which is a kind of a source of their power in the community. They, however, had never been involved directly with any of these real power brokers on the white side of town. They operated through the mayor, who was, of course, the instrument of the economic community. And it was only when our movement came along did they ever get to meet any of these people, like the folk that ran Riches and the money people in town. They had never met any of these people. So we were disrupting that good thing to the extent they had it, that they had. But so we didn't know of the sacrifices that many of them had made, on our behalf that made it possible for us to be where we were. Made it possible for us to go to college, first generation in many instances that we go to college out of our families. And, a lot of things that they had done we didn't appreciate. So it should not have been a surprise to us that the generation succeeding us would have less appreciation or no appreciation for what we had done to change things on their behalf. Yeah.
Sorry, Brother Black. Sorry to interrupt one more time. Be mindful of your microphone. You're hitting it.
Yeah, I realized that when
He did that. Okay.
yeah, I realized that I'd done it after I did it.
All right,
Thank
we're at 1725.
We're doing. Oh, I'm enjoying this. I've still got so many questions. I know we'll go over, but tell me about the backdrop of Morehouse. Here on this wonderful campus, you even mentioned that in Florida, you wouldn't have been able to go. There was not a school for you to attend, a college for you to attend.
That's right.
There. So, what was it like to be on this campus the time you walked on campus, to just having this serve as a place of support for everything you all were doing in the Atlanta student movement?
Well, it was a unique experience for me, in the first place, to be around so many educated adults, that looked like me. I was inspired by that, and to realize that some of those folk had gotten PhDs, when my parents were young and all that, and that was not a part of my experience growing up. Although everybody lived in the same community, you had your doctors, your pharmacists, your teachers, and your everyday folk all living right by each other, and everybody knew each other kind of. But I was not accustomed to the intellectual environment that I experienced coming here, and I found it invigorating. And we had again a cross-cultural kind of experience to the extent that we were different. Kids from different parts of the country. You share their experiences with them, and things were just new and different. And it was a very supportive community. You felt safe here. We didn't have curfew in Morehouse, but that didn't matter because the girls had one at Spelman. So visiting hours over at 6 o'clock at Spelman, so you didn't have anything else to do, go and study. But the bad thing about that, though, just interestingly, our dinner hour, the line closed at 6 o'clock as well. So we were trying to spend the last possible second with the girl over at Spelman, and rush back to get in line before it closed, both at 6 o'clock. So there was a name given to people like me. We were called Willies, which meant, will he make it? But that's, the kind of the tenor of the day. But again, what I enjoyed, one of the things I enjoyed most about being here was being on campus, living on campus. And we had these bull sessions at night, we called them, where we studied together, and that was really special. And any student, in my opinion, should spend at least the first couple of years on campus so they can have that experience, preferably all four, because the campus life is entirely different from living off campus and coming and going. You miss out on a lot of the spirit and excitement of things.
Did you have any idea, though, that with everything you were doing and being here on campus and the Atlanta student movement, that when you finally did graduate, when you walked away and stepped into the real world, that you could look back and say, I had something to do with some of the change that's taking place?
Not really. I didn't really even think about that in terms of any long-term perspective of history. I just didn't. Number one, I didn't have any good sense of history because I never had a good history teacher. Learn these dates and places and names and all that sort of thing, and I found it to be extremely boring. I wish so badly that I'd had a good history teacher because it's so important. But if I'd had someone who could talk about and teach you about things in context, what was happening at this moment, what was the climate like, what was the food like, what was the religions, all that sort of thing, then I would have gotten excited about that. But I didn't have any real sense of history. And so I think that carried over into my lack of appreciation of a long-term perspective of what we had done, what had gone on before us, and where that might eventually lead. We did assume, however, that when we took the barriers down, got the signs removed and laws changed, that everything was going to be just downhill from there. It's going to be a sweet rolling ball that just got to better and better land. We kind of assumed that because we saw the signs and the laws as the barriers. And my assumption was that once people get to know each other as individuals, they'll like some, they'll dislike some, and that's fair. That's the way it ought to be. I used to say that, but I spoke to the liberals back during that time. After we had spoken for a while, somebody would invariably say, yeah, but you're different. I said, that's exactly the point. We're all different. All of you are different from each other, and we're all different from each other, and we are very much the same in so many important respects. But once people, I said, now, if you know me and don't like me, that's fair. But if you don't know me and you don't like me because I look like somebody else you didn't like or somebody else you didn't know, that doesn't make any sense to me. So I really assumed that once we had the barriers down and freed white people as much as we freed ourselves to interact with us and us with them, that all would be well, and things would just get increasingly better. What we didn't count on, however, was that bigots had babies, and they taught those kids to hate. And they have been using every means at their disposal to roll the clock back for the past 55 years from what we were doing. And they've been very, very successful. And the thing that has been missed by so many of us is that money is at the root of everything. We have the best Congress, the best local and state governments that money can buy. And for the most part, they're all bought. And you have a tremendous concentration of wealth in the hands of very few people. And they're the ones who call the shots. The Koch brothers' name come up a lot. And there are others of those billionaire and multimillionaire folk who finance the campaigns of the people to do their will. And they're doing their will, which is not our will. And the way you counter that, of course, is with what we have at our advantage. Our numbers, if we get above our butts and register and vote and understand the issues and the candidates, and if we use our economic buying power to withhold money from those who oppress us so that we are not financing our own oppression, those are the two things that we have at our advantage that we're not using to the extent that we should.
How do you mobilize people in this world we're in right now? It seems like, to me, it's amazing. Technology is everywhere and it's wonderful. But it seems during times where there was very little to no technology, you could amass throngs of people to get together, commit to regular meetings, regular organized plans. Today, with all of our technology, and one app could open the door to this very thing you're talking about, even if it's from the perspective of an economic boycott. Why aren't we using it, and what's wrong with us that we're not using it?
Well, I think the bottom line is that we content ourselves with slogans. Black Lives Matter. They call it a movement. It's not a movement. It's mostly a slogan. You got a lot of disparate people all around saying Black Lives Matter, but where is there a plan of action, and what are you trying to achieve? A movement is by its nature, and I created this little thing myself, and I like it. It involves a deep commitment to lofty ideals on the part of a lot of people doing a lot of different things over a long period of time. So the movement has to be multidimensional. If you don't have all of those aspects, you don't have a movement. You know, you might have an action, you might have a press conference, you might have a picket line, you might have a slogan, but you don't have a movement. You know, and people need to know what it is you're trying to achieve, which is why our document, an appeal for human rights, helped so much. People knew what we were after. And people also have to know the facts of what is. I mean, you know, if folk don't realize the extent to which they are being screwed, you know, they are not mobilized to do anything about it. We need to understand that like 90% of the wealth of this country is concentrated in the hands of less than 1% of the population. There's something wrong with that picture. Martin King, in the speech he made a year before his assassination of the Riverside Church, he talked about the triple evils of militarism, racism, and economic inequality. Oh, good thing we don't have those problems anymore, right? We do. And the economic disparity has gotten greater than it was, you know, then or in the 70s or 80s. There's more and more concentration of wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer people. And they own the politics of this country, and they own the politics of the world. So until we do something to change that, which means taking some money out of the pockets of those people who wish to oppress us, and actually registering and actually voting, and not waiting to see who's going to run, but find people who deserve to be in office, search them out, help to groom them, get them elected. You know, a lot of folk who offer for election don't necessarily have your good, your interests at heart, even if they look like you. They may be looking for an opportunity for graft, or they may just need a job. You know, any of that. They may not have any clear vision for the future. You don't wait for folk like that to declare and see which one is less bad than the other to vote for them. You seek out folk, you know, who deserve to be in office and try to help them get there.
And especially in the time right now, you know, some may say that we're living in a repeat of the civil rights debacle, that it seems as if there is more pain being inflicted on our young people of color, than ever before. And then there are some who say, no, this problem always has been here. It's just technology has afforded us an opportunity to shed a brighter light on it. What about all of the work that's been done in the civil rights movement? What's happening right now in 2015? Seems as if we're going backwards. What is the solution as someone who walked through it the first time?
Well, I think your point is very much the answer. I think the technology just reveals more of what has always been happening. I'm not sure we're going backwards. We just haven't moved forward that much as people have been led to believe that we have, or that they convince themselves that we have, because you don't want to think that things are stagnant. But in fact, you know, anybody who says this is the post-civil rights era, that must have been asleep, you know, with Rip Van Winkle or something. I mean, if we don't continue the battle that we have and pass batons forward and keep the pressure on and enlighten ourselves to what needs to be changed and how to change it, you know, we're always going to be stagnant or perhaps falling backwards. I think that the fact that so many of us were allowed to think that we were born free, that, you know, it's a whole new day, and all we have to do is live it and appreciate the new housing opportunities we have and get in a good job and move on up to the east side and all that. That's but you forget that when you get in your car, you're driving black, you know, and that could be dangerous. Or if you have a hand in the pocket or something, when the cop stops you, you may be dead. I mean, we need to realize, the mayor of Atlanta mentioned a few weeks ago, if I remember correctly, there was like 80% of the policemen in Atlanta don't live in Atlanta. You know, we should have done something about that a long, long time ago. In first place, I don't know whether you can require that folk live in the city, but you can incent people to live in the city. Pay the folk more who live in the city, who are going to be your policemen. And they should come from among the folk they police. And they should know the police, I mean the people they're policing, and those people should know them. Officer Jones, good to see you. Not who's this strange guy coming here with a gun and a badge ordering me around. When we had the Atlanta newspaper, the Atlanta Inquirer newspaper, which we didn't talk about, grew out of our movement. I was editor of it for about 3 years or so. A case came to our attention of a young white cop beating up a mild-mannered black guy, 40-some years old, on the west side of town with his billy club and all that. Our paper had such stature in the community because of the movement that it grew out of. We made a campaign about that to the extent that the chief of police invited me and John Dale Johnson, who was writing for us, down to a meeting. And when we were there, he had somebody bring this guy's file in. And when he read it, the guy had 3 letters of reference in his file. One from the mayor of his little town up in North Georgia, one from the chief of police, and one from the sheriff. 2 of them said, he's from a very bad family, will not hire him under any circumstance. The other one said, he's from a very bad family, but maybe he's different. And the chief said, how did this guy get hired? I said, that's a very good question, Chief. From North Georgia, up in the mountains somewhere, coming here to police, you know, black folk in the community. Made no sense. It doesn't make any sense now. And we need to change that. And if our politicians are awake and doing what they ought to be doing, they do something about that. I'm sure the same thing happens in all these other cities where we had all the shootings and brutality and all. Quite often they're police who don't live with the people, don't know the people. So they're afraid of them. So at the slightest provocation in their mind, they're going to shoot to kill because they think this, they think that. And there's this great fear generally in the broader community of black males. You know, we're supposed to be big and bad and mean and all that sort of thing and dangerous. That's something that's come down through the years from slavery and all that, you know. The only thing to do is to oppress us and to control us.
Do you, in these final moments, we have about a minute left, are you optimistic about the future as it relates to race and what's happening right now? Are you optimistic?
Well, I'm neither optimistic nor pessimistic. I am kind of practical in the sense that I know that if things don't change, things won't change. And by that I mean simply if we continue to assume that somebody else is going to fix it or that everything's just going to be all right, it will get progressively worse because the people who have the money want to continue to amass more and more of the money, and the thing they want us to do is to fight among ourselves about things that ain't got nothing to do with me. You know, who you sleep with and what religion you are and whether you have an abortion or not and all that sort of thing. Yeah, y'all fight about that. You know, y'all fight about that. While I take more money and go to the bank and I'll deal with my big issues like should I buy another island or 4th plane or 5th house, all those big problems I have to deal with. Y'all fight about all that old silly stuff. And that's how they are able to continue to survive and climb higher and higher on the ladder that we're looking up at. Better wake up.
Thank you. Awesome. Awesome.
All right.
I
Yes.
just have a question.
Mm-hmm. The answer is I wasn't there when it happened. I didn't do it.
In light of, you mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement or
Slogan.
slogan.
Yeah.
And here lately, on a lot of the college campuses, there are a lot of actions going on, and they're calling for reparations. You know, the Jews got reparations for their Holocaust.
Yeah.
The Japanese who were in the internment camps got reparations.
Yeah.
What is your thoughts on reparations for the descendants of slaves, African slaves?
We're on camera with that?
Sure.
Yeah.
You can look at her.
Oh, okay. Well, you know, on the question of reparations, the folk with the money ain't giving up the money, you know, freely. Frederick Douglass said, the power concedes nothing without a struggle. It never has, it never will. So, that may be a pipe dream to some extent, although it's a worthy notion. They owe us big time. We built this country for free. And
Start over.
So on the subject of reparations, your thoughts?
I think it's something that is deserved, but it's not likely to ever happen because the folk who have the money intend to keep it. And as Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a struggle. It never has, it never will. So I think perhaps as long as we're talking about folk making us whole for all the work that our parents and ancestors have done and what we have done, for lower wages to enrich them, it's not likely to happen as such. It happens for Jews, it happens for Japanese, but it's not likely to happen for us, mainly because we don't have the organized power of our numbers and our resources. If we had all that, you might achieve something like that. But in the meantime, there are other things that could give us some equality or equity in the stake of this country. We can insist on real education, real payment for our wages, right? Real opportunity to move up the ladder economically, to amass wealth. But part of that is kind of on us. One of the things that I don't understand is that why there are so many black churches collecting millions of dollars on Sunday who don't put them in financial institutions that they own, the community own, and require that they reinvest those funds in the community. That seems very simple to me, but it's not happening, and I don't understand why. But that's part of taking care of your own reparation. You can reinvest in your own communities. Currently, it is said that the black dollar comes in on Friday and it's gone by Monday because we don't own what we're buying, and we are consumers rather than producers to a great extent. So we can change that ourselves without needing anybody to vote, at the White House or under Congress or State House or anything. We can do that. And if we do, we can begin to make some serious changes.